Hello, and you're very welcome to this special video that we're creating here in the Pearse Museum for National Heritage Week 2021. So the subject of this video is a project we carried out last year to conserve the manuscript of a pamphlet written by James Pearse, who was the father of Patrick and William Pearse, the two of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, and I suppose the subject of the Pearse Museum out in Rathfarnham. This pamphlet is one of the, I suppose, the jewels of the Pearse Museum collection. And to give it its full title, it is A Reply to Professor Maguire's pamphlet, England's Duty to Ireland as it Appears to an Englishman. So the format of this video, in the first half, I'm going to talk a little bit about James Pearse, about the pamphlet, and I suppose the reason he wrote it, and I suppose its significance as well in terms of understanding James Pearse and its influence, particularly on Patrick Pearse. In the second half of the video, we'll be joined by Dr. Pat McBride from the Paper Conservation Studio. Pat was the conservator who carried out the conservation work on the pamphlet last year, and he'll talk us through, I suppose, more of the technical aspects of what had to be done to the manuscript to conserve it and preserve it for years to come. So I'm going to start with just a short PowerPoint presentation with some images that will hopefully kind of illustrate the story of this object. So we just go to, apologies for the delay. So as I said, the title of this video is Conserving the Manuscript of James Pearse's pamphlet, England's Duty to Ireland as it Appears to an Englishman. So as you can see there, on one side we have the manuscript as it was prior to conservation, and the other one we have the completed piece, and it's quite a dramatic change that has occurred to it. And it was written, as I said, by James Pearse, who was the father of Patrick and William Pearse. He was born in London in 1839. He was born into quite a poor family. According to Pearse's autobiography, they lived in a garret in Bloomsbury in London. But when he was quite young, the family moved to Birmingham. And this, I think, probably was quite a crucial move for James Pearse. Birmingham was a kind of a growing city at the time. It was a real powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in relation to things like engineering. It was a center, for example, for gun making and that real kind of precision engineering, which meant the working class in Birmingham in particular often included quite skilled men and women. And these men and women were very interested in often in radical ideas, but also in getting access to education. So within Birmingham, there were opportunities for education, which it would seem was just as well, because James Pearse had very little formal education, and his foray into attending Sunday school at the local church didn't work out. Apparently the clergyman who was running it threw him out of the class. So he was apprenticed to a chain maker. He didn't really enjoy that work at all, and also his employer seems to have been a very difficult person. But he eventually got an apprenticeship as a stone carver, and he worked as a stone carver in Birmingham. And while he was, I suppose, learning his trade, he was also trying to educate himself at night. And in many ways, he's part of a whole movement among working class people in Great Britain and Ireland in the 19th century who were, as I said earlier, kind of thirsty for knowledge. And Patrick Pearse himself, in his autobiography, described his father working in the daytime and in the art school every evening. He read books by night and came to know most of English literature well, and some of it better than most men who have lived in universities. And as we saw on the previous slide, Birmingham, it had a new museum, it had an art gallery, it had public libraries. So there were opportunities for James Pearse to, as I said, to educate himself, but also to meet other working class people at these evening classes that were being run by mechanics institutes, by university in Birmingham had one of the earliest of the, or referred to as the red brick universities, the modern universities that were being set up in the 19th century, I suppose to respond to the demand amongst the population in England at the time for education. So we are very fortunate in the Pearse Museum that we have many books from James Pearse's own, I suppose, personal library. One of the features of a lot of the books he collected over the years were the quality of the illustrations. I suppose because he was working as a stone carver in and was, I suppose, a visual craftsman or artist. These illustrations were very important in terms of inspiring him, but also helping him learn his craft, working, as I said, in a visual medium like sculpture. So this is an illustration by Gustave Doré from his edition of Milton's Paradise Lost. But what is also remarkable is, I suppose, the range and variety of James Pearse's interests. So there's, we can see here, there's this book, The Inquisition and Judaism by Carlos Vero, which was published in 1845 and was a response written to an anti-Semitic sermon preached by a Portuguese archbishop at an auto de fe in 1705. So it was published, as I said, by Moses Makata, who was a Jewish publisher in London in 1845. But it's quite a rare and quite an, I suppose, almost obscure book, but clearly something that interested James Pearse. We also have A Natural History of Animals by Karl Voigt, who was a Swiss naturalist, and I suppose a follower of Charles Darwin, and would have kind of shared many of Darwin's ideas around kind of evolution and things like that. We also have, for example, a Quran, an English translation of the Quran. And of course, the other thing to remember about these books is, because they're in the Pearse Museum collection now, that means that Patrick Pearse and his brother and sisters would have had access to these books growing up. And I don't think there were many households in Dublin at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century where you'd have had something like a copy of the Quran available, certainly not from the kind of middle class or working class background that Pearse came from originally. James Pearse was also very interested in radical politics. So he was a follower of Charles Bradlaugh. Bradlaugh was a Republican. He was also an atheist, and he campaigned for the rights of people who didn't profess a belief in religion. He ran into trouble when he was elected an MP because he refused to take an oath to a God that he didn't believe in. And I said Bradlaugh would have been a very real radical in the 19th century in Britain, and James Pearse was very close to him. He actually corresponded with him, and just before Bradlaugh's death, James Pearse wrote to his daughter, and he said in this letter that nobody other than his own father had more of an influence on him than Charles Bradlaugh. So you can see that James Pearse's kind of quest for knowledge is leading him down some very interesting but also some very radical paths. Now, he probably had to be very quiet about these beliefs, let's say, when he came to Ireland. He first came to Ireland in the 1850s as a kind of a journeyman stone carver, and eventually he settled here in the 1860s. He married an English woman, Emily Susanna Fox, and they had 4 children, 2 of whom survived. And during this period, James Pearse converted to Catholicism, though it would seem that this conversion was as much based around the fact that in order to progress within his career as a stone carver, where most of the work was coming from work in Catholic churches that were being built throughout the 19th century, and there was a whole boom in church building in Ireland in the 19th century following Catholic emancipation. And I think from a business point of view, an economic point of view, James Pearse realized that unless he converted to Catholicism, he wasn't going to be able to really make any great headway in the stone carving business in Ireland at the time. So this is a copy of the Building News from 1871. It's an image of the Church of St. Augustine and John on Thomas Street. In the 1860s, James Pearse carved 12 saints, which appear just around the top of around the base of the spire of this church, and can still be seen today. Now, James Pearse's his first wife died, and just about a year later, he married his second wife, Margaret Pearse, in 1877. I suppose in some ways he was a young father. He needed a wife, and also I think he was a man who for whom family was very important. I think his among his ambitions was to have a family, and he writes in some of his letters about how much he missed his own family, and he remembered in a very kind of sentimental way his own childhood, surrounded by his parents and siblings in London and Birmingham. So they marry in 1877, and over the next few years, they have 4 children together. Patrick, the oldest is Mary, is Margaret. You can see there sitting with her doll on her lap. On the other side, you have Patrick Pearse standing up beside the bench. Willie is beside his father, and on Margaret Pearse's knee is Mary Bridget, the youngest daughter. These photos were taken on the same occasion, as you can see, though interestingly, there are some changes in terms of the costume. Mrs. Pearse has her hat on in one and takes it off in the second. But interestingly, James Pearse also changes his headgear, but he has 2 hats with him. And what's interesting is the kind of slightly bohemian quality of his headgear. So in one, he has this very kind of broad brimmed, almost cowboy hat, and the other is this I suppose we'd nearly describe it as a Russian fur hat. And I think this headgear is a kind of a subtle nod on his part to the fact that he is somewhat bohemian in his beliefs. And certainly Pearse describes again in his autobiography his father's friends coming to visit them in the family home. At that stage, they lived over his stone carving business at number 27 Great Brunswick Street, now Pearse Street, of course. In his biography, Pearse describes how these bohemian friends of his father's would come and paint him and draw him, and again, just how kind of colorful they were as people. This is number 27, Great Brunswick Street, and these are the employees of James Pearse at the time. So you can see it's quite a large business. So he goes from being a journeyman stone carver here in Dublin, working for other people. Then he goes into partnership with a number of different colleagues over the years. Eventually, he goes out on his own, and the business becomes known as Pearse and Sons, because both his son from his first marriage, James Vincent Pearse, and William Pearse join his father. But Patrick also helps out with the business, though he's kind of very much tied up pursuing an academic career and studying both languages, and also he studied for the law. But I said this is Pearse's premises, and I suppose in the towards the end of the 19th century, certainly for kind of the 1870s through to James Pearse's death in 1900, he becomes one of the biggest stone carvers, or he owns one of the biggest stone carving businesses in the country. So this is St. Mary's Church in Athlone, where he got the commission to do the pulpit, and actually panels from that pulpit can now be seen in the Pearse Museum. Between about 1880 and 1890, he went into partnership with another stone carver like him, originally from England, a man called Edmund Sharp, and one of their big commissions is a group, a carved group for the roof of the National Bank on College Green, often referred to as Éireann go Bragh. This was the logo of the bank at the time. It had originally been founded by Daniel O'Connell, and you can see here this kind of personification of Ireland as a woman, and she has all the kind of signs of Irishness. She has her harp, and there's a wolfhound, but she's also surrounded by signs of Irish industry and prosperity. So you have presumably kind of barrels of porter and whiskey. There are bolts of cloth. There are what looks like a ship in the background as well. And this can still be seen on the roof of number 34 College Green, which is currently Abercrombie and Fitch. And actually we again have the maquette of this piece. So this is the preparatory sculpture that they would have made in advance of actually carving the stone piece. So this would have been done in plaster. And again, this is on display in the Pearse Museum, which is free to visit, and we're open all year round. These are some images of his work, or work carried out by his companies or his businesses. These are magic lantern slides that he had made. So you can see here there's an image of the marriage of the Virgin and Saint Joseph, and then the other one is Christ among the doctors in the temple. This is another piece that James Pearse himself had photographed. It's from about 1885. It's the Burke Memorial in Glasnevin, and again, the Burke Memorial can be viewed. It was it was a memorial to Ellen and William Burke, and it's in the O'Connell Circle, so in a very kind of prominent position within the cemetery. And his work can be seen kind of across the country. So one of the pieces furthest west is a memorial to the Reverend Michael O'Donoghue, a priest out on Arran Moor in the Aran Islands, and that was from 1893. But he also did some work in England and Wales, and this is one of his biggest commissions anywhere. This was a stone rood screen paid for by the Marquis of Bute for St. Peter's Catholic Church in Roath in Cardiff. And unfortunately, while the church does survive, the rood screen did not survive Vatican II, and unfortunately it no longer exists. And the success of this business allowed him to provide his family with a very comfortable existence. So in some ways, Pearse could have be seen to have kind of started off in a kind of a lower middle class realm, but as the years go on and as the business prospers, they're definitely a kind of a solidly middle class family, and they move to the new red brick suburbs of Dublin, settling, I suppose, probably the place that they live the longest is in Newbridge Avenue. So they kind of move out to the suburbs from the city centre, though Patrick and William do commute back into the city to attend the Christian Brothers School on Westland Row. And I suppose the other thing to bear in mind is that Patrick and William Pearse and their sisters Margaret and Mary Bridget, they grow up surrounded by by James Pearse's sculptures, but also by the things that he has amassed over the years, that the engravings, the casts of famous works. So they grow up in a very kind of visually rich environment, much more visually stimulating and aesthetically stimulating than many of their contemporaries at the time. And this definitely influences Patrick and William Pearse in particular. William, very obviously, in the fact that he becomes an artist, but Patrick, you know, in everything he does, from the books that he publishes to the way he runs St. Enda's School later on in the 20th century. So much of it can be seen to have its roots in this very aesthetically inspiring and rich childhood. So again, you know, these are images of items in our collection now. So, you know, we've engravings of a bas relief from a cathedral in Orvieto. You can see there is the head of the Laocoon, one of the most famous classical statues now in the Vatican Museum. We have not one, but two engravings of the Last Supper, and you can see again how that would have been very important for James Pearse in particular, because the Last Supper is unsurprisingly a very popular image to present on the front of altars in particular. But also, you know, there's really interesting and very fine engravings. So we've some very nice 18th century engravings. You can see here the martyrdom of San Sebastian by Il Domicino and the birth of the Virgin by Annibale Carracci. In addition, both James Pearse and his son Patrick were very enthusiastic about magic lantern slide machines and magic lantern slides. And apparently it was Patrick who first kind of got the bug for it and asked for one for his birthday. And these would have been used to give kind of illustrated talks, and Pearse writes, actually Pearse's sister Mary Bridget writes about these kind of illustrated talks that they that the family would have put on for each other, but mainly it would seem Patrick Pearse and his father James. So these are some of the magic lantern slides from the Pearse family collection. So you can see images of one of the great international exhibitions in Paris. You can see there's an engraving of Venice, images of Florence, Trafalgar Square. These are also very interesting as well. These are images of a Native American and what looks to me like maybe an Inuit woman. But again, of course, the very tantalizing thing is to wonder, you know, in what context did they show these images? Though we do know that James Pearse does seem to have been interested in the injustices that were meted onto Native Americans in the 18th and 19th century, because he has two books on that subject in his library. Earlier, you know, I showed you some images of Birmingham, and they were part of a collection of images of Birmingham, James Pearse's native city. And this is one of the images as well. This is Stratford-on-Avon, which is quite near Birmingham, and is most famous, of course, as the birthplace and the home of William Shakespeare. And James Pearse seems to have had a great love of Shakespeare, which is something that was shared by his children. Patrick Pearse, probably his favorite writer, certainly his favorite writer in English was Shakespeare, and he owned multiple copies of Shakespeare's work, and the family used to, do little performances of Shakespeare for each other. And Pearse's, one of his, I suppose, his party pieces was Mark Antony's speech from Julius Caesar, and also the speeches from Hamlet. So we also have these notes, which were written by James Pearse for a talk that he used to do about Birmingham, but we know that Stratford and Avon was was one of the images that he used in this presentation. So as I said, I suppose we kind of get an idea of who James Pearse was. I said a man who had a great love of learning, even though he may not have had kind of a very much kind of formal education as we would have known it. So I suppose now we turn to the subject of of this video, which is his reply to Professor Maguire's pamphlet, England's Duty to Ireland as it appears to an Englishman. So he wrote this pamphlet in 1886 in response to a pamphlet by Dr. Thomas Maguire, who was professor of moral philosophy at Trinity College in Dublin. Professor Maguire had published an article called England's Duty to Ireland as Plain to a Loyal Irish Roman Catholic. Maguire's piece is quite an extreme piece of polemic in which he portrays Home Rule, which is, I suppose, the big political movement in Ireland at the time. Maguire sees Home Rule and the Home Rule Party as a disaster for Ireland, which he says will lead to chaos, bloodshed, and pogroms on the Protestant population. He describes the Home Rule Party as being wanting in industry, honesty, veracity, self-respect, and cleanliness, while their supporters were mere oafish lovers of chaos, and he characterized them as the unsuccessful man at college. And he says that they're just people who are out to try and obtain some kind of position for themselves in life. And I often think there's something, it is perhaps unsurprising that this academic who spent his life in Trinity College sees the worst insult as the unsuccessful man at college. Maguire also accuses the Catholic Church of supporting Home Rule solely in order to gain more power in schools. And apparently when James Pearse read this pamphlet, he turned from his normal quiet persona, and Patrick Pearse actually describes his father as being kind of quite withdrawn, almost a melancholy figure, though quite kind of melancholy and withdrawn, but kind of very loving with it. But apparently his mood changed, and he cried out, "I'll teach that bloody fellow a lesson. He ought to rinse out his mouth." The reply that he produced, that we have the manuscript for, is at least 4 times as long as Maguire's, and he basically takes on his opponent's argument almost phrase by phrase. Now, at times when you're reading it, he feels as if he's almost overly anxious to display his own reading, and he quotes from the classical authors like Polybius, Gaius Gracchus, and Tiberius Sempronius, as well as Joseph Addison, who was a writer in the 17th century, as well as more contemporary figures as well, like the Irish historian Thomas D'Arcy McGee, W.E. Gladstone, who would have been Prime Minister at the time, and the English politician John Bright. Now, some commentators have felt that James Pearse seems slightly pompous in this pamphlet, but I feel it's important to recognize the inequality which existed between the two protagonists in this kind of battle of pamphlets. And I suppose the courage and self-confidence required for James Pearse, who is a stone carver with no formal education to speak of, to take on a representative of the academic elite. In this context, it was essential that Pearse asserted his pride in being a self-made man and demonstrated that a man from his background was also capable of intellectual erudition. While the central thesis of the pamphlet is a rejection of Maguire's criticisms of Home Rule and the Parnellites, there is also a sense that James Pearse is angry because he feels that Maguire has used his position in education to mock the less educated masses. And at one point, he writes, "Excuse my persistence, but I am a humble man, but like yourself, object to being gobbled up by a Yahoo or a professor." Maguire describes female Parnellites, so I suppose Parnell's female followers, and of course you have to remember that women played a very important role, particularly in the Land League. Parnell's sisters Anna and Fanny Parnell set up the Ladies' Land League while Parnell was a prisoner in Kilmainham jail, along with the rest of the movement, or the rest of the male part of the movement. But anyway, Maguire describes these women as being more ferocious than les Lecheuses. And James Pearse replies that when a man of education goes out of his way to choose a foreign term of the worst meaning with which to paint the women of those he politically differs, the objectionable word is too good for him. So this group, les Lecheuses, were also referred to as les Lecheuses de guillotine, and these were these women who, these kind of bloodthirsty women, or certainly as they were portrayed, who hung around the guillotine during the French Revolution, during the Terror, and kind of goaded those who were being executed. And the literal meaning is the liquors, or the liquors of the guillotine. And I think there's probably kind of a vulgar meaning tied up in this as well. So you can see maybe why James Pearse is so outraged by this kind of very patronizing and just very kind of rude and disrespectful way that the Home Rule movement have been described in Maguire's pamphlet. James Pearse's political views, as laid out in the pamphlet, are those of, a committed Parnellite, and when the split comes, the Pearse family, they are a pro-Parnell family. So the Home Rule movement essentially breaks apart later on in the 1890s, when a scandal breaks, when it emerges that Charles Parnell has had a relationship with Catherine O'Shea, who's a married woman. But as I said, the Pearses appear to have been on the pro-Parnell side. But as I said, as well as showing his commitment to Parnell, James Pearse also displays a particular admiration for Michael Davitt, who's, I suppose, the founder of the Land League in many ways, and was, like James Pearse, was a self-made man and a self-educated man. Michael Davitt was born into a kind of peasant family in Strade in County Mayo, and then moved with his family to Lancashire, and he spent his childhood working in a cotton mill in Lancashire, where he lost one of his arms. But again, like James Pearse, he educated himself, and was a man who's very kind of interested and conversant with kind of culture and literature, and this is reflected in his writings. And I think you could see why James Pearse would particularly have connected with Davitt and Davitt's story. Now, interestingly, although James Pearse portrays himself in this pamphlet as actually a very loyal Catholic, and he's very supportive of the church, I should also mention that there is very, very strong evidence that this was not his only pamphlet, not the only pamphlet that he published, but the other pamphlets he published were published under a pseudonym, the pseudonym of Humanitas. James Pearse was a supporter of the Free Thought movement and the Free Thought Publishing Company, which published anti-religious texts in London, and Charles Bradlaugh was this was his publishing company, and this is just one of these pamphlets that James Pearse would seem to have written. There's lots of evidence when you're reading these pamphlets of the fact that the author is resident in Dublin, is very familiar with the stone carving trade, is very familiar with Birmingham, and there's also in James Pearse's business accounts there are entries for ads that he's taken out to publicize pamphlets in the Agnostic Journal and other kind of free thought publications. So again, it's kind of interesting that the manuscript that we have is the only one that he published under his name. And I suppose the other thing is, in political terms, it shows James Pearse to have had nationalists, albeit constitutional and certainly, I suppose, more moderate than the views that Patrick Pearse in particular would have had. Though interestingly, Patrick Pearse, up until maybe the kind of around 1912, he's more or less a home ruler in terms of his political beliefs, although he does have a great kind of love and admiration for kind of Irish revolutionary history. But it is kind of interesting to see in terms of this pamphlet that James Pearse publishes in 1886 under his own name, that he is pro-Parnell, pro-Home Rule, and apparently Pearse was very proud of this pamphlet and would often kind of read it as an adult. And then, James Pearse influences his sons in lots and lots of ways, and influences Patrick Pearse in particular in lots of ways. But I do think it's also interesting that Pearse himself becomes a pamphleteer, and you can see here these 5 pamphlets which he published in 1916, just months before the Easter Rising. So again, it's kind of interesting to see these kind of echoes of his father in Patrick's work, and how he developed as a politician and a revolutionary. So that's the end of the first half of our video, and in the second half we're going to be joined, as I said, by the Conservator Pat McBride, who carried out the conservation work on the manuscript of James Pearse's pamphlet. So I'm joined now by Pat McBride, who's a paper conservator with the Paper Conservation Studio here in Dublin, and Pat carried out the conservation work on the manuscript of James Pearse's England's Duty to Ireland as it appears to an Englishman. So thanks very much for joining us, Pat.
Hello, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen now and give people a sense of the what the original manuscript looked like prior to conservation. So Pat, this is an image of the manuscript prior to conservation. So could you just talk us through a little bit about its condition when you were presented with this project of restoring it?
Sure. It was, as you can see from the top cover, it was in very poor condition. But that damage was concentrated at the stop. Effectively what it is a handwritten manuscript. There are 2 types of ink visible here on the top page, which is black, straightforward black ink, and red ink, which it has annotation there underneath the sign of the signature of James Pearse. And it's exactly what we would expect a document of this type and nature, the condition for it to be in. A lot of tears, bottom right-hand corner section was missing, a lot of tears in the top page, a lot of surface dirt, creases, nicks, tears, support damage, support loss. The whole document itself was held together by a metal clip up the top left-hand corner. You can see that. And that ran through a punch hole that ran right the way through all the different sections of paper. It is foolscap size, so it's slightly larger than it would have been a legal document at that time, so slightly larger than what we would know our A4 today. And there's a faint line, ruled line in on the background. It's not very heavy. It was probably much stronger when it was paper was first used, but that has faded quite significantly. From our point of view, the first thing we would have to do with the document of this type is number all the pages. We need to have a pagination. We need to know the order we get it in, and it's very important that we maintain that order. So we would ourselves get in and number each page, and as soon as that's done, then we can begin to work on the object. In this case, it was very easy to release and free the material. We just opened up the clip on the top left-hand corner, and that would have released everything. The book itself, or the pages themselves, were never bound. It's probably unusual in and of itself that it wouldn't be that it would be loosely held in this way, but it was a manuscript. It was something that would have been added to and taken from, and it needed a degree of flexibility for the author to be able to work their way through. Our first conservation intervention would be to surface clean the document itself. So we would have three different techniques that we would use. Initially, just to brush, very carefully brush the surface and brush away any surface dirt. The second intervention would be to use a chemical sponge or smoke sponge to reduce down, which is a very, very soft, gentle eraser. And then the third one would be to come out for some stubborn stains, to use either grated eraser or a solid eraser to remove them. And then after that, we would work our way through the book, using those techniques to reduce down the amount of surface dirt. But in this instance, most of the damage was concentrated at the start, and it's the same with a lot of books that are used and thumbed and used on a regular basis. The damage is concentrated at the start. The paper itself was very good condition, was relatively strong. It was the damage at the start prevented people from being able to go through and discovering what was in the rest. So most of our interventions were concentrated around the top page and through to the third or fourth, fifth page within the volume itself.
So if I show there, that's I suppose the finished product there. So you can see some of the interventions that you've made there. So in terms of those areas of loss that you've replaced, what would you replace them with?
We replaced them with a Japanese paper. We use Japanese paper extensively for both infilling and for repair. As a medium, it is, as a support, it's very soft but durable. And it fits in well. Also, from a tone point of view, it's a relatively neutral tone, so it doesn't interfere with the object itself. You can see from the after photograph that it is the document itself is quite considerably improved in condition. A lot of discoloration is taken out, surface dirt is gone. It is now fully supported and strengthened, and where areas of loss have happened in the past, they've been supported again by adding in documents to the piece itself.
And we can have kind of a before and after now, so you can really appreciate the dramatic.
It's quite a. You can see from the left, the pre-treatment photograph, that there's quite considerable discoloration just within the paper itself. Now you have to allow for different light settings, but even still, the post-treatment, you can see a fair bit of discoloration has come out of the paper.
That's great. And if I just go on to this, is I suppose the final product. So this object is going to be going back on display in the Pearse Museum, and people familiar with the museum will know that a lot of our exhibition cases actually consist of exhibition drawers. So that involved, I suppose, an extra layer in terms of how you mounted this object. And
this was curious in that we had to take into consideration how it would be displayed and housed within the drawer. My main concern is the movement of the drawer puts a pressure on the volume. It's hard to see from here, but this is a stack of papers stuck that high. So they're paper upon paper, and there's no in the previous arrangement there was a cord running through it to hold it in place. When you're opening and closing the drawer, you're going to be moving that sheet around, or that block of paper around quite a bit. So I was very anxious to try and come up with a solution that presented the manuscript in some sort of visual, consider the visual presentation, but also that would provide a fix or a hold or to stop it moving around. So what we've done here is we've created a window mount, and on top of a tray out of conservation board into which the manuscript sits. And to hold that in place, there are two strips of mylar running left and right down the long ends of the volume itself that hold it in place. Those strips feed through the backboard that it's sitting on, and they're held off on the back. And we also, at the very back, we have Velcro, and the intention would be to put the Velcro to attach, to hold the piece in place via Velcro on the base of the case and on the back of the actual base of this little arrangement. So we found that the past Velcro is extremely strong when used properly, and it should provide a very good and stable hold for the whole arrangement once it's in the drawer. You should be able to open and close the drawer, and it shouldn't put any pressure and any risk on the object itself.
That's great. So I'm just going to stop the share here. So just to thank you very much for coming along and joining us today, Pat. This is a really fascinating document, and I suppose I should also admit that you have mentioned to me for many years that that it was something that we should be kind of looking at in terms of conservation, that it would benefit from a little bit of love. So it's great to...
It's nice to be able to talk to you in Heritage Week with the document fully conserved, Brian.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much, Pat.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks, Brian.